Hello there. Welcome to another episode, and this is Vinod Narayan. Today we have a very interesting guest with us. It is none other than Shashi Tharoor. And what we're going to do is that we're going to talk to him about his book, The New World Disorder and the Indian Imperative, co-authored by Shashi Tharoor and SamirSaran. Thing with Shashi Tharoor is that by the time we as readers catch up with his books, he's gone on to his next book. And this time I think he's got two books after The New World Disorder, Tharoorosaurus and The Battle of Belonging. So probably I will catch up with those books much earlier than, he's one author who goes much more faster than the reader. So let's go ahead and listen to Shashi Tharoor. If you've not subscribed to the channel, subscribe, like, comment, and let's hear what Shashi has to say. Hey,
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing good. How are you, Shashi?
Not bad. I gather you want to do this in English, is it?
Yes, we'll do in English because last time when we did it in Malayalam, a lot of people told me that I was doing the major amount of talking. So I thought English,
പക്ഷെ താങ്കളുടെ ഫാൻസിന് ഇഷ്ടപ്പെടുവോ ഇത് ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൽ എന്നാലേ
അത് ശരിയാണ് ഫാൻസ് ബട്ട് in Kerala people are also trying to look at English, and the only challenge I see over there is that everyone thinks that unless they speak English in the accent that you do, that it doesn't complete them, and that is one of the tragedy that we have in Kerala, that people stop speaking. People decide because they always feel that they're not pronouncing things well. So but since the book is in English, I thought maybe there would be a lot of people who would like, and what is being talked about in the book is very relevant to a lot of people, and it's not just going to be in Malayalam. So that's
in English, and then I have two more books that may be of interest to your viewers. One is my book on words, Tharoorosaurus. അതിന്റെ
yes.
മാതൃഭൂമിക്കാരൊരു മലയാളം ബൈലിംഗ്വൽ എഡിഷൻ കൊണ്ടുവരുന്നുണ്ട്.
Okay.
അപ്പോൾ അത് കാണാം, അതൊന്ന്.
Right.
രണ്ടാമത്തത് എൻ്റെ വരാൻ പോകുന്ന പുസ്തകം 1-ാം തീയതി, The Battle of Belonging, which is my book on nationalism.
Okay.
The theory, concept, practice of nationalism worldwide, and so on. And that will come out in Malayalam and DC books, but I would rather speak about it in English to have the right language.
Right.
So താങ്കൾ അതൊക്കെ നോക്കിയിട്ട് ചെയ്യും. താങ്കൾ ഇന്ത്യയിൽ വരാനൊരു പ്ലാൻ ഇല്ലേ? എവിടെയാണ് ഇപ്പോൾ?
Now in San Francisco, but I was planning to be there in May, June, because my book, we had discussed about that, right? Just I thought that we would do it in May, June, then pandemic, then obviously got. But otherwise things are staying at home, staying safe, covering the face, not seeing people smile, so you get very confused. There's a psychological impact to it as well.
അതെ.
And
I have to meet people, which normally I do with a mask on, and they're wearing a mask too. So I'm smiling to welcome them, but they can't see my smile. And I have no idea if they're smiling at me. All I can see is their eyes.
Right. Very true. So we've got about half an hour. So I'll just run through the thing. So what is it? The New World Disorder and the Indian Imperative. So this is what happens when you read a book when you don't understand much of it, and you have to keep these notes, referring to what it is, and maybe later on reading it once more. The first question is, did you feel nostalgic writing the book? Because
Nostalgic for my UN days, isn't it?
yes, from your UN days.
Well, having spent 29 years there, a lot of the issues are very much part of my daily bread and butter of that era. But in the dozen years since I've left the UN, now 13 years since I've left the UN, I have felt free to look at the UN with a much more critical eye because of the detachment that comes from being out of it. And that's why I've been somewhat critical, particularly about the distribution of agency in the international system. When you say agency, you're referring to the capacity of individuals and institutions to act independently and to make their own free choices. That no longer reflects contemporary realities in the world. And it partially explains the anger and disappointment against globalization, the real rise of nationalism and self-assertion in many countries should not surprise us when 10% of the global population controls 84% of its wealth. So that's also something which perhaps when I was at the UN, because I was inside the belly of the beast, as it were, I could not perhaps be as critical of from outside, because I'm looking at the fact that the world is full of anxieties about globalization, anxieties about technology and technological change and dominance by a few, questions of how represented they are in the international system. And as an Indian parliamentarian, my loyalties have shifted from those who are running the international system to those who want a new voice in a reformed international system. That's where I've come. So nostalgia would not be a totally accurate statement.
Yeah. So, but you're more involved with national disorder than world disorder many times, right?
But in the Indian context, I've always tried to keep an interest in world affairs. I've commented. In fact, for 5 years, I was chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs, which meant that I was the principal person outside the government dealing officially with foreign affairs. So many visiting ministers and ambassadors regularly used to call on me. Now, for a year, I'm not in that position anymore because this new government or re-elected government got rid of me from the External Affairs Committee. And I'm now chairing the IT Committee, Information Technology or Information and Technology. But some of the issues of that are also of global resonance. So I keep my global orientation intact.
So one of the word, and you mentioned about pandemic. You said that there's a possibility for something like a global pandemic impacting us. So if I had read this book at some other time, that word wouldn't have caught my eye. But you mentioned about pandemic. So this book was written before the pandemic came. And how do you see this world disorder, or is there going to be some order, or is that disorder going to be different post-pandemic, even though we are not post-pandemic? How do you, from what you, because sustainability, you look at, see, we see that the climate change impact that would be happening. So if people were to talk about climate change, maybe people who were not very well, people who didn't want to really talk about it would also be ready to have that conversation now, knowing how things would impact us globally, right?
So I'll address both the issues, maybe climate change first, because the COVID pandemic is, of course, ongoing and it's very important. But the 2020s, even before COVID, was seen to be the crucial decade for climate action and climate politics, because the impact of climate change is now more visible and more devastating than at any time in history. Now, for example, there are people fleeing countries affected by bad climate, and climate refugees are outnumbering those fleeing conflict or looking for economic opportunity. And I must say that we're living in a world in which individuals, businesses, states, various entities are at war with their environment, and they're only doing short-term thinking. You have to build a building, who cares if dust goes? You have to run a factory, or you generate power through a coal plant, who cares about how you're polluting the atmosphere? You are throwing sewage into rivers. You are emitting greenhouse gases that are warming up the world, and that in turn are melting the polar ice caps, that are affecting, that are creating tsunamis and heavy cyclones, all sorts of places. All this is now affecting us in real time. And therefore, if the world couldn't manage this existential risk, are we going to be able to cope well with any other global challenge? Now, the pandemic, as you rightly said, has borne out the concerns expressed in my book, because the pandemic has brought out the waning legitimacy of international institutions. Look at the whole debate about the World Health Organization's response to the COVID outbreak, with its perception that it indulged the official Chinese line for far too long. And the perception through the WHO's experience that many of our global institutions and their agencies suffer from politicization, in this case by powerful member states like China, manipulation by those who wish to exercise their influence over it, and lack of representation for smaller and less powerful countries. No independent leadership, because the leadership is obviously beholden to member states. And all of this is happening while there is a parallel rise in national sovereignty and nationalist resurgence. So that taken together, our world I think in the COVID pandemic, we're very clear our world seems increasingly less willing to cooperate and less able to cooperate. So the real issue we have now is that the recognition of our interdependence and shared resilience, and frankly, the fragility of our global society that led SamirSaran and me to write the book, The New World Disorder, has, I think, absolutely been showcased by COVID. Because had global governance been working effectively, the world would have identified the coronavirus as soon as it emerged. It would have sounded a global alarm earlier about its dangers. It would have identified and publicized the best practices that should have been adopted by all countries to prevent or limit its spread. And that this didn't happen. The COVID pandemic has been a damning indictment of the state of our new world disorder. So I believe that we really have to make a serious effort now, because the rapid and global spread of the coronavirus pandemic is a reminder of the consequences of that disorder, right? Because very clearly, if we don't get this act together, and you just start reasserting America first, India first, Russia first, whatever it may be, and you give a damn about the rest of the world, the abandonment of global responsibilities will affect us all. It's shocking to me that in the middle of a pandemic, that Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the WHO. Instead of strengthening it, it's like saying you're taking water out of the fire engine hoses while they're busy fighting a fire. And that's what the Americans have done. Now, it's very clear that when the pandemic is over, the globe must learn lessons about what happened and how international systems and institutions can be strengthened and can be radically reformed in order to forestall its recurrence. How can we do that unless we're all together and working off the same page?
Right. So you mentioned a lot about China and where China is, how that whole power play, and one interesting thing that you mentioned is that China and India, unlike Germany and Japan, they're not trying to overturn the order, but they're trying to get a better space in this whole discussion and on the table, right? Now, with pandemic, China has a different, and before pandemic also, China has been getting more mileage, and the way economy has been over there and everything. Where does India stand? Is there a China model India follows, and or is there anything else that India does? Because these are the two.
Actually, powers. Our model is very different from the Chinese when it comes to our. We've been very good citizens of international organizations. We have been actually terrific in terms of our being loyal to the institutions, supporting multilateral solutions to crises. We were an early contributor of peacekeeping troops to the UN system. We were an early campaigner against apartheid and racial discrimination. We led the vanguard of the fights for decolonization. Our Prime Minister then, Indira Gandhi, was one of the very few heads of state that attended the first environmental conference in Stockholm in '73. I mean, India has been very much on the side of the angels, as you would say, as a good member in good standing of the international system. And our credentials, therefore, in the UN have been quite remarkably respected over 75 years. The Chinese, on the other hand, first they were excluded because Taiwan held the China seat. Then in '71, Taiwan was ousted and communist China took over the seat. Initially, and when I say initially, I mean for about 3 decades, the Chinese were actually very reticent. They did not take any strong steps. Only if something directly affecting their interests like Tibet or Taiwan or Hong Kong came up, they would express a view. Otherwise, they just kept very quiet, let the existing powers run the organization, while they concentrated all their energies on getting rich and becoming prosperous, the peaceful rise of China. Now, in the last decade, they've become much more active and in a rather belligerent way. That is that they've not just been doing contributions to the UN, they have been trying to demand leadership in the UN. So they have already headed a couple of UN agencies, WHO, UNIDO, and so on. They've put their candidates forward and won these positions. They have been very assertive about the Chinese interests. So, for example, it's now an open secret that when WHO sent or tried to send a delegation to Wuhan in the first week of January to study the outbreak of coronavirus, the Chinese didn't give visas to the officials. They said, we will invite you when it's right. There's no need for you to come. We'll keep you informed. That kind of assertiveness is very different from the way in which you expect a cooperative country to behave in a UN system like this. So my own view is that the Indian model of contribution to the world order has actually been much better, but China will have an important role to play because it has the money and the economic clout, and increasingly with that they bought themselves military clout as well, that their views cannot be ignored. You're looking at a country which may actually become within the foreseeable future, certainly within this coming decade, the largest economy in the world. And the result of that is that you're going to see in China a country that not only demands attention, leadership, authority, and influence, but which commands it because others will say, we can't do without China, and they will come to China. I wanted India, I remember 30 years ago, in 1990, saying to the then Indian ambassador to the UN, Amir Banjao, he was privately lamenting to me that because of the terrible economic situation that India was in, that we had no choice but to follow the Western line on the Iraq conflict, despite our good relations with Saddam Hussein. And I said, until you become rich, you will have to listen to those who control your purse strings. India at that point was facing a terrible financial situation. We had even sent our gold to London to stand guarantee for an IMF loan. In those circumstances, no question of us taking a truly independent stand on any issue on which the big powers, our creditors, our donors, our helpers, were united. And on this one, where America, Russia, China, everybody was in favor on the same side saying Saddam Hussein must withdraw, India quietly went along. So I said to them 30 years ago, the answer is in becoming rich. If India becomes by itself a strong, rich, prosperous country, then we won't need to be demanding a Security Council seat. People will come to us because countries will say, we cannot imagine the UN Security Council without India. Today, no one is saying that, and that's our biggest challenge. And I have to say that going through a terrible time this year, economically, in COVID mismanagement, we still haven't recovered from the body blow of demonetization, the botched rollout and implementation of GST, the serious unemployment crisis. All of this is before COVID. Everything has got 10 times worse because of COVID. So it's really, really a tough time now. The pandemic has accentuated the governance challenges confronting most emerging economies, but India seems to have a particularly tough challenge. So I would like India very much to get its act together domestically and economically, because India's strength in helping right the new world disorder, in helping create a new order, a revised new order, India's strength would be if it could be the world's first development power. That is, if its rise can be linked to its ability to provide governance solutions to the development needs of the millions of people in developing countries in Asia and Africa. And it can only do that if India is in a position to reboot the ethic and method of global cooperation. If we find a world that is dangerously slipping into exclusive arrangements, America first. Now, America wants to give millions of dollars and corner all the vaccines for its own citizens first. How do we then effectively respond to global challenges unless we're all cooperating? How can WHO be effective if the richest, biggest country in the world is not there? I believe that we have the capacity to adeptly navigate ideological and political diversity. But I think, frankly, we need to first solve our problems at home before we can be an effective big citizen abroad.
True. And so you also mentioned in the book that in 2018, it was the 12th consecutive year when the global freedom has declined, right? And a lot of countries, the political freedom of political rights, civil liberty, and everything is declining. About you mentioned about 71 countries on that. And you also make a statement, people cannot be forced to be free or practice democracy. Now we have democracy, China doesn't have democracy, and there's a lot of things, and many democracies, they're trying to be very exclusive and trying to be more nationalistic and everything. Freedom, they don't really care about all these things, right? And is that they're trying to adapt and trying to get the bigger piece of the cake in a new world order? Is that, do they think that they have to talk about this global freedom in a very restrictive manner to even get the bigger part of the cake?
It's a good question. As far as democracy is concerned, by the way, I've often said, even before this book, that democracy is rather like love. It has to come from within. It cannot be imposed from outside. So if a country wishes to be democratic, its people will demand it. If a country loses democracy, it's because the people have not fought for it. And that's something which we have to understand. China is not democratic in that sense, but the Chinese people seem to be reasonably content with a situation in which their main interest is in making money and leading better lives, and they don't particularly seem to want or expect political and civil rights from the government. Whereas in India, for 70 odd years, we've had a functioning democracy. And when we see it being threatened, eroded, or hollowed out institutionally, we have every right to resist and fight and demand through effective dissent our rights for ourselves. And that is something which, to be honest, I don't think that we have any right to abandon, because if we do that, we actually abandon the most precious legacy left to us by the generation that won us our freedom. Now, having said all of this, at the global level, those who have power usually tend to call the shots. So certainly when Russia was a fearsome communist state and not a democracy, it had tremendous influence in the world system. The moment it collapsed, of course, its story was over. China now is on the rise, and it's doing so with a certain amount of belligerence. It has imposed challenges upon its neighbors. It has, for example, not only intimidated Hong Kong and Taiwan by the new security law in Hong Kong and aerial reconnaissance of Taiwan, because you can say those are our places. You can even say that when it comes to the oppression of the Muslims of Uyghurs, the Uyghur Muslims of Xinjiang in the western part of China, that in fact there is no question that they are not able to function in normal ways that you would expect in a democracy. But the Chinese have got away with it because even Muslim countries are not willing to protest the mistreatment of the Uyghur Muslims, because China is such a major benefactor and donor. And so a country like Pakistan, for example, has chosen to bite its tongue because it cannot afford to antagonize the Chinese. So power and wealth are still the most important and influential currencies. And then if you look beyond China's own quote unquote territories and look at the neighbors, they have run into conflicts with practically every neighbor, with Japan over the Senkaku Islands, with the Philippines, with Vietnam over oil exploration, South China Sea, with India on the border. They have pushed their way. I mean, it's like the old American joke about the 198-pound gorilla on the beach. That's what China is, and it moves everywhere, kicking sand in the eyes of all the smaller people around on that beach, and that's what's happening in the world today. So I don't want to exaggerate the importance of democracy in actually producing effectiveness on the global stage. I think democracy is an internal matter. I think countries should value it for themselves and for their own people. And if they do, then they should fight to preserve it for themselves. But whether democracy makes you more welcome or more influential on the global stage is a debatable proposition. And I think China may be in the process of disproving that proposition, because its power and influence and wealth are all growing while its democratic credentials are crumbling. Not that it had many credentials to begin with. And that's the absolute truth, Vinod.
Yeah. And isn't that scary? Because, you mentioned that in China, there is no democracy. There's never been like a democracy, and people are okay with that kind of stuff. So there are a lot of people, even in India, if you look at it, people will start thinking, okay, kind of stuff. And isn't that scary? Because what we define as India, the pluralistic way of what India is and democracy and everything, I mean, without that, and when more people think that, okay, the problem is that democracy is the issue that we are having, that we are not being able to move forward. If that kind of a conversation and stuff, and I've heard that from people when I talk, that we have to have this kind of control, one single party, but that is scary, right?
That is absolutely, to my mind, unbelievable, because the fact is that democracy has been in many ways one of our biggest strengths. It has been precisely democracy that has empowered all sections of our society and everyone, irrespective of what background, religion, language, caste, creed they profess. And to my mind, it is absolutely startling when an Indian would say, and I know Indians have said this because I've also seen the polls, that they consider that democracy is dispensable. I believe that that's very unwise, and to be very honest, I think it's very disturbing that they should even think that way. But the counter argument would be, right now, democracy is helping us, for example, to make common cause with countries like the US, Australia, Japan, for example, the quadrilateral grouping, the so-called Quad that has come up, because the one thing they can point to is say we are all democracies and we have certain common perspective on the world, and we also want to ensure certain rules are observed by everybody, including freedom of navigation, including rights of free passage, including the sovereign right of the small countries in the neighborhood not to be bullied by the big one, namely China. And because China is not a democracy, inevitably this is seen as being an effort to resist and contain China's growth and expansion.
Right. So now I have a few statements I took on UN. And so one of the things that I figured out, there's so much acronyms. Is that how you speak in the UN, or because it's very tough to figure out what they are? And you have given the explanation for each of that. And so the statements you had in that is that UN has never been and can never be a perfect body. I never thought that way. I was thinking that, okay, you have UN, and there are a lot of people who would think that, okay, UN is there, it's perfect, things are fine. And that was one statement. And then another one was, UN was not formed to take mankind to heaven, but save humanity from hell. This was a statement by someone that you put.
Dag Hammarskjöld, the second Secretary General of the UN, said that. Exactly. So the reason I've said both these things, is that if you look at the first statement, that it wasn't a perfect body, it's not perfect because it mirrors the world. If the UN is a reflection of the world as it is, including its inequalities, its injustices, the imbalances of power between the rich and the poor, all of that, when the UN is sitting around the table, it's a collection of governments who reflect the way the world is. And because we are an imperfect world, the UN is bound to be an imperfect reflection of an imperfect world. And that leads into the second thought, that sometimes the best the UN can do is to prevent things from getting worse. In other words, it can't always ensure a perfect outcome, because very often the UN has no strength of its own. It only has what member states are willing to delegate to it. So when a member state or a collection of member states, for example, in the Security Council, gives the UN money or troops to enforce a peace or a mandate that is realistic and doable to get something done, then you have a situation where the UN succeeds. But if, for example, the member states are disunited, or there is a Cold War standoff between two countries, or one country is blocking an initiative of the other, the UN can't act effectively. And therefore, the best the UN can do is often just to prevent things from getting worse, because to solve it requires a political will and a consensus that member states have to come to. There's a famous line when somebody told Stalin about the Pope's disapproval. He said, how many divisions has the Pope? In other words, army divisions. And that's the same question can be asked to the UN. The UN has no divisions of its own. Every battalion the UN gets has to be contributed by member states. And so that's something people tend to forget. The UN is both a stage and an actor. As a stage, it's a place where the member states will play their parts and disagree and agree and work out their differences. But as an actor, it can only be as strong as the member states empower it to be.
And you mentioned about UN having an elasticity for peacekeeping, right? But elasticity can reduce over a period of time, right? So what stage would it be down the line? So how do you ensure the elasticity remains strong enough for you to take care of the peacekeeping? Is it again dependent on the states?
In my own case, when I was in my 29-year career at the UN, 7 years were spent in peacekeeping. And in the course of those 7 years, we went from about 8,000 troops to 80,000 troops. Okay, and we went from 4 rather stable operations to 18 at the peak. And so I'm talking about a UN which expanded dramatically, and then that shrunk also. The 18,000 came down to half a dozen, now it's up again to 13. The numbers have come down and gone up. That ultimately is what the UN is like. It responds to the needs of the world, it responds to what member states wanted to do, and to what member states are prepared to pay for and provide troops for. So that ultimately is all that we can really point to.
Okay, so I've got a couple of questions more, and then we can wind up. So you mentioned if data is the new oil, attention is the currency, right? And attention is something that is very scarce for a lot of people. I mean,
I agree.
And so people who have better attention to things, they're richer. Or how do we put this thing? Data, obviously, I understand from an oil perspective. Yes, you have more data. Google is stronger with the data. Facebook is stronger with the data. But if we give more attention to Facebook and Google for what they're doing, then we are not increasing our currency. So I'm thinking, where can I bring this attention and the data part together is what I was thinking.
You know, they'll tell you, attention comes these days increasingly with the media also, right? So if the media is going to give you attention, and now the media is controlled in a much more decentralized way, because media includes social media, it includes blogs, it includes, for example, what you're doing has got you a certain amount of attention from a certain very focused and admiring group of viewers, and that is an attention you have commanded that perhaps in the pre-digital era you might not have commanded. Definitely. I don't mean in any way to be disparaging. On the contrary, as an admirer of yours, I feel that that's actually a plus point for the way in which the nature of attention has changed in the world. So whether it's television channels looking for eyeballs, whether it is bloggers and vloggers looking for people to follow their ideas, whether it is a newspaper trying to increase its circulation, or whether it is a country trying to get the support and goodwill of the world, you are talking in every case of attention. And that's why, you know, as you're finding, for example, that Google and Facebook are able to monetize your attention. Similarly, attention on the part of the global system comes no more only on the basis of principles or of policies. It also is simply who you are. So China at the moment commands a lot of attention because of who it is and what it does. But tomorrow, a small place, for example, the enclave called Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijan, which is the object of a major conflict going on right now between Armenia and Azerbaijan, has suddenly got our attention. It hadn't had it for many years. So attention is a very influential currency, because when you have the world's attention, you can try and leverage the world into helping you, or as it happens, in some cases, the world may oppose what you're trying to do, but that attention is an influential currency. And you said, how do I link it to data? Well, how is information conveyed in this digital era? It is all through data. Your and my conversation becomes a data package and goes into somebody's mobile phone or laptop computer.
That's right. Okay, so final, I wanted to just get back to pandemic. In fact, everything that happens, I mean, there are many bad things that happen around us, but we could see the value part of it, how we emerge out of it, right? It makes us, anything that doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So once this pandemic is over, or we start knowing how to live with pandemic, because this is not the last time a pandemic is going to come. It'll come again, and we would be better able to cope with it as we move forward. How do we, as India, emerge at this stage, knowing all these global disorder that existed before and everything, as a nation or as an Indian person? Maybe I'm an Indian living in US, and there are Indians living in many places and Indians living there. How do we emerge ourselves with all democracy, pluralism, with everything that we are talking about, and all the threats that we know is happening? How do we come out and say, damn, yes, we are here?
All right, so very many answers to that, but the central division in the answers between the Indians in India and the Indians abroad the Indians abroad can emerge in their own societies to the extent those societies welcome their emergence. So in a democratic country like the US or Canada or whatever, Indians are very influential. It was once pointed out that Mr. Trudeau's cabinet in Canada had more Sikh ministers than Mr. Modi's cabinet in Delhi had. So Indians can actually exercise clout. In America, you now have a half Indian vice presidential candidate. You've had Indian governors, Indian senators, and there's a tremendous sense that Indians are influential out of proportion to their numbers. Now, equally, there is no doubt in my mind that Indians in India have a very different kind of challenge to emerge. For them, it is to connect to the global village, right? I mean, you've got 500 million villagers in India who are cut off from all the advances of the global village. And they would like very much to be part of it. They would like very much to have the opportunities that the rest of you enjoy globally. And that's something which I think you must not underestimate or overlook. So having said all this, as far as Indians abroad are concerned, they should, it seems to me, speak for themselves, first of all, in terms of their own domestic interests in the countries where they're resident, which may or may not have anything to do with India. But secondly, once they've established their own interest and position, they could demonstrate their emergence by also speaking for India's interests in those countries. So that, for example, in America, I know that the bulk of American voters will vote in their own beliefs and their own interests in this forthcoming American election. But once they have an administration, particularly if they have an administration that they have contributed money to or donations to or whatever, then they should be in a position thereafter, if they were so inclined, to say, look, this matters to me as an Indian and I want you to vote this way, or I want you to do this, or I want you to take that decision, whether they're talking to a senator or a congressman or an administration official. And I believe that the American system is set up to permit that kind of thing. So in a democracy, your emergence can actually be showcased in an effective way. Now, in a non-democracy, I think Indians will simply have to keep their heads low and go along with whatever the system in that country expects of them. And I don't think we should second guess that or gainsay that. But I would say that given where you are and the bulk of your audience would be, I think that the emergence of Indians, both as a phenomenon on the world stage and as an influential set of opportunities for leverage for the government of India and for the interests of India, that has really been on the ascendant for some time and is even stronger now than it was before. So irrespective of who's in the Indian government or the complexion of the Indian government, the Indians as a group have now, it seems to me, emerged quite definitively and have a tremendous amount of influence. I just hope that the Indian government also gets its act together domestically, ends the challenges to our social cohesion, the increasing division and communal hatred being promoted in this country, and returns to an India of which the diaspora can also be proud. And then collectively we can all agitate for a better shape for India in the world, rather than being divided amongst ourselves, as has been the case for the last little while.
Very true. And now when you look at US elections, many Indians feel they have a skin in the game as well with Kamala Harris there. You know, people
Yeah, exactly.
A lot of people talk, because that was not something that was always in discussion for a lot of people, right? And that is an interesting perspective. People talk about it. When people ask me, they ask, okay, what's happening in the US election? I said, why is it? No, Kamala Harris is there, right? So we need to know what's happening over there. That's how we connect with each other as Indians, just like probably any other country people would connect with each other when they are across the world, right?
Right.
So I think that's all, Shashi. And are you in Delhi now?
I am in Delhi. I think we will be stuck here for a little while longer, as the pandemic yet shows no sign of declining either in Trivandrum or in Delhi. But before too long, I hope to be back in my constituency. Meanwhile, I deal with it. Even today, I helped inaugurate an event in the Trivandrum Medical College Hospital. And there'll be things like that will keep me connected on a daily basis to what's going on in the constituency. but we still have to overcome the challenges. And you people in America should be braced for a new resurgence of COVID, I understand. So be strong and be brave and be safe.
Yeah, so that's what we're doing. I mean, not going out unless it is that necessary, and not trying to be a COVID idiot, as you as you mentioned before. And
Indeed.
And because we don't know what's happening, right? So we can't really, because earlier it was not a big issue, but then you started hearing about friends and friends' relatives and people like that who got COVID, who succumbed to COVID. And so it's much nearer than what we initially thought reading in the newspaper.
Right. So true. So true. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks,
and
Shashi.
Lovely to see you both.
Yeah.
Take care.
Yeah, take care.
Thank you.